My name is Donovan Mercado. I was a traffic enforcement officer in Phoenix writing parking tickets when the world froze over in 30 days. Volcanic ash blocked the sun, temperatures dropped 60 degrees, and civilization collapsed around me. While everyone else fled or died, I used my knowledge of every street, building, and tunnel in this city to survive the Ice Age apocalypse. This is how I lived through humanity's darkest month, when summer disappeared forever. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. October 15th, 2025 started like any other Tuesday in Phoenix. I was Donovan Mercado, 34 years old, and I had been walking the same downtown beat for 8 years as a traffic enforcement officer. Most people saw me as just another guy in a uniform writing parking tickets, but I knew every inch of those city blocks better than anyone. Every fire hydrant, every loading zone, every meter that ran fast or slow. I carried my citation book, my radio, and a small emergency kit that I kept stocked because my police academy training had taught me to always be prepared. I never imagined that habit would save my life. The morning started normal enough. I clocked in at 7:30, grabbed my route assignments, and headed out to 5th Street near the courthouse. The weather report had called for sunny skies with a high of 92 degrees, typical October weather for the Sonoran Desert. I remember thinking it was going to be another routine day of expired meters and illegal parking in loading zones. I had been studying for the police academy entrance exam for months, memorizing emergency protocols and communication procedures that seemed like overkill for a traffic cop. Those procedures were about to become the difference between life and death. By 10 in the morning, I had already written 12 citations. There was the usual crowd of lawyers and court employees who thought they could park wherever they wanted, delivery trucks blocking fire lanes, and tourists who had no idea how Phoenix parking worked. I knew all the regular violators by name and vehicle. Mrs. Chen with the blue Honda, who always pushed her luck on the 2-hour limit. The construction crew that parked their pickup in the handicapped spot every Tuesday. The courthouse security guard who thought his badge meant he could park in the loading zone. These details might sound boring, but knowing patterns and recognizing when something was different had become second nature to me. Around noon, I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. The sky started turning an odd shade of gray, not like storm clouds, but something thicker and more ominous. I had lived in Phoenix my entire life and had never seen clouds like these. They seemed to hang motionless in the air, getting darker and denser by the hour. The temperature was still normal, but there was something in the air that made my skin crawl. I checked my radio to see if there were any weather alerts, but all I heard was routine chatter between dispatch and patrol units. I was walking past the federal building when my radio crackled with the first emergency broadcast. The voice was tense, barely controlled, announcing that Yellowstone National Park was experiencing significant seismic activity. We had been hearing reports for weeks about increased volcanic activity in the region, small eruptions and steam vents that the scientists said were normal for a supervolcano. The news had covered it as an interesting story, not a threat. But this broadcast was different. The announcer mentioned multiple eruption sites and ash clouds forming over the western United States. At first, I thought it was just another false alarm. We got emergency broadcasts all the time in Phoenix, usually for flash floods or extreme heat warnings. But something about the tone in the dispatcher's voice made me pay attention. I had spent years listening to radio chatter, and I could tell when someone was trying to stay calm while delivering bad news. This was that kind of broadcast. I pulled out my small notebook where I kept track of unusual incidents on my beat and wrote down the time and details. That habit of documenting everything would prove more valuable than I could imagine. By 2 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour. 20 degrees. In Phoenix. In October. I had never experienced anything like it. People started coming out of the buildings on my route, pointing at the sky and talking in worried voices. The gray clouds had spread across the entire visible sky, blocking out the sun completely. It looked like the thickest storm front I had ever seen, but there was no wind, no lightning, just this heavy, oppressive darkness hanging over the city. My radio was buzzing with activity now. Emergency services were reporting similar conditions across Arizona, Nevada, and California. The broadcasts mentioned that volcanic eruptions in Yellowstone had been joined by eruptions in Iceland and other locations around the world. Ash clouds were spreading across the northern hemisphere, and temperatures were dropping rapidly in multiple cities. I started to understand that this was not a local weather event. At 2:30 in the afternoon, exactly 8 hours into my shift, ash started falling from the sky. Not the fine dust we sometimes got from distant wildfires, but thick, chunky ash that looked like gray snow. It coated my uniform, my citation book, and every surface around me. The ash was warm to the touch and had a sulfurous smell that burned my nostrils. I watched it accumulate on car windshields and sidewalks, covering up the familiar landmarks of my beat. People were starting to panic now. The usual orderly flow of pedestrians and traffic was breaking down as everyone tried to figure out what was happening. Some were getting in their cars and driving away. Others were standing around taking pictures with their phones. I used my radio training to monitor multiple emergency frequencies, switching between police, fire, and emergency management channels. The picture that emerged was terrifying. This was not just a Phoenix problem or even an Arizona problem. The entire western United States was being covered by volcanic ash, and temperatures were dropping everywhere. I knew I had to make a decision about whether to abandon my post and go home, but my training kicked in. During emergency situations, essential personnel were supposed to remain on duty to help maintain order and assist with evacuations. I also knew from my years walking these streets that I had knowledge and skills that might be needed. I knew which buildings had basement access, which ones had emergency generators, and which ones had the best shelter from the elements. I knew the location of every fire station, hospital, and emergency supply depot in the downtown area. The first real sign of chaos came around 4 o'clock, when the grocery stores started getting overwhelmed. I could see the lines of people stretching out of the Safeway on Central Avenue, everyone trying to buy water, canned food, and batteries. The parking lot was a disaster, with cars blocking fire lanes and people abandoning their vehicles wherever they could find space. Normally, I would have been writing citations, but I realized that parking violations were the least of anyone's concerns now. My radio was broadcasting continuous updates about the volcanic eruptions. Yellowstone was confirmed to be in full eruption, with ash clouds spreading east across the United States. Iceland's volcanic system was also erupting, contributing to the ash clouds over the Atlantic. Other volcanoes around the Pacific Ring of Fire were showing increased activity. The meteorologists were predicting that the ash clouds would block sunlight for weeks or months, causing dramatic temperature drops and crop failures worldwide. I spent the rest of the afternoon helping direct traffic around the chaos at the grocery stores and gas stations. My years of experience managing traffic flow and crowd control were suddenly very relevant. I knew how to keep people moving, how to prevent bottlenecks, and how to spot trouble before it escalated. Several times, I had to intervene when frustrated drivers got into arguments over parking spaces, or when someone tried to cut in line at the gas pumps. As the sun set, or rather as the ash clouds got even darker, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. It was now 55 degrees in Phoenix in October, colder than it had been since the previous winter. I could see my breath for the first time in months. People were starting to realize that this was not going to be a temporary inconvenience. The ash was still falling, and the radio reports were getting more dire by the hour. I finally went home around 8 o'clock that night, after my supervisor told all non-essential personnel to secure their areas and report back in the morning if conditions allowed. My apartment was a small one-bedroom place about 10 minutes from my beat, and I had always kept it stocked with emergency supplies. Growing up in Arizona, you learn to prepare for power outages, water shortages, and extreme weather. I had cases of water, canned food, batteries, flashlights, and a battery-powered radio. What I did not have was cold weather gear because Phoenix never got cold. The temperature continued to drop through the night. By midnight, it was 45 degrees, and I could hear ice forming on the windows of my apartment. Ice in Phoenix in October. I spent the night listening to emergency broadcasts and trying to understand the scope of what was happening. The reports were coming in from around the world now. The ash clouds were circling the globe, blocking sunlight and causing temperatures to plummet. Scientists were using terms like volcanic winter and global cooling event. I woke up on October 16th to find my apartment freezing cold and covered with a fine layer of ash that had somehow gotten inside through the windows and air conditioning vents. The temperature outside was 38 degrees and there was a thin layer of ice on my car windshield. I had lived in Phoenix for 34 years and had never seen ice form naturally on anything. The ash was still falling and the sky was so dark it looked like twilight even though it was 8 in the morning. My radio was broadcasting emergency instructions for residents to stay indoors, conserve heating fuel, and avoid unnecessary travel. The governor had declared a state of emergency, and the National Guard was being activated to help with relief efforts. But I knew from my emergency training that government help would be overwhelmed and that people would need to rely on their own resources and knowledge to survive. I decided to report to my post despite the emergency conditions because I knew the downtown area would need someone with my knowledge and skills. The streets were almost empty except for emergency vehicles and a few hardy souls trying to get to work. The ash had accumulated to about 3 inches on the ground, making everything look alien and unfamiliar. But I still knew every street, every building, and every shortcut in my area. When I got to the courthouse, I found that most of the government offices were closed, and that the few people still around were trying to figure out what to do next. The emergency management office was operating with a skeleton crew, coordinating with state and federal agencies, but obviously overwhelmed by the scope of the crisis. I checked in with them and offered to help with whatever they needed, using my knowledge of the local area and my radio communication skills. The reports coming in throughout the day were increasingly grim. The ash clouds were not dissipating as quickly as hoped, and meteorologists were revising their predictions about how long the temperature drops would last. Instead of weeks, they were now talking about months or possibly years of reduced sunlight and colder temperatures. The term ice age was being used for the first time in the scientific reports. By the end of the second day, October 16th, the grocery stores were completely sold out of non-perishable food, batteries, and heating supplies. The gas stations had long lines of cars, and several had run out of fuel entirely. The power grid was starting to strain under the demand for heating, and there were rolling blackouts in some neighborhoods. I could see that the normal systems that kept Phoenix running were beginning to break down. On October 17th, the third day, I woke up to find that it had snowed during the night. Snow in the Sonoran Desert in October. There was about an inch of actual snow mixed with the volcanic ash, creating a gray, toxic slush that covered everything. The temperature was 32 degrees, freezing, in a city where the average October temperature was supposed to be in the 80s. Knew that this was not a temporary weather event. This was the beginning of something much bigger and more dangerous. The volcanic eruptions had put enough ash into the atmosphere to block sunlight on a global scale, and the effects were going to last much longer than anyone had initially predicted. I also knew that my knowledge of Phoenix, my emergency training, and my skills at managing people and resources were going to be essential for survival in whatever came next. As I prepared to leave my apartment that morning, I grabbed my citation book, not because I planned to write any more parking tickets, but because it had blank pages where I could document what was happening and keep track of important information. I also made sure my emergency kit was fully stocked and that my radio had fresh batteries. Something told me that the skills I had learned as a traffic enforcement officer and the knowledge I had gained from 8 years of walking the same streets were about to become the most important qualifications I had ever possessed. The city I had known for 34 years was disappearing under ash and ice, but I still knew every building, every street, and every resource that might help people survive what was coming. As I stepped out into the frozen, ash-covered streets of Phoenix on that third morning, I had no idea that I was about to become one of the few people who could navigate this new world and help others do the same. The fourth day changed everything. I walked out of my apartment building into a world I barely recognized. 3 inches of ash mixed with snow covered every surface, and the temperature had dropped to 28 degrees. 28 degrees in Phoenix. The palm trees that lined the streets were dying, their fronds brown and brittle from the cold and toxic ash. Cars sat abandoned on the sides of roads, covered in the gray slush that made driving nearly impossible. I had spent 8 years learning the delivery schedules for every business on my beat. UPS came to the courthouse at 9:15 every morning. FedEx hit the law offices on 3rd Street at 10:30. The Coca-Cola truck restocked the vending machines at the Federal Building every Tuesday at noon. That knowledge seemed useless now, but it gave me something more valuable. I knew which businesses had loading docks, which ones had backup generators, and which ones kept emergency supplies. Information that was about to become crucial for survival. The Safeway on Central Avenue looked like a war zone. The parking lot was full of abandoned shopping carts and scattered trash. People had been camping out in line since before dawn, and fights were breaking out over the last cans of soup and bottles of water. I watched from across the street as store security tried to maintain order, but they were overwhelmed. My 8 years of dealing with angry people who got parking tickets had taught me how to read crowd dynamics and spot trouble before it exploded. These people were scared, desperate, and running out of options. I used my radio to contact the emergency management office and report what I was seeing. The voice that answered was stressed and exhausted. They told me that similar scenes were playing out at every grocery store, gas station, and pharmacy in the Phoenix metro area. The supply chains that kept the city fed and functioning had been designed for normal conditions, not for a volcanic winter that was blocking supply routes and causing panic buying on a massive scale. My knowledge of the city's infrastructure became relevant in ways I had never imagined. For 8 years, I had written tickets for delivery trucks that blocked fire hydrants, parked in loading zones, and violated weight restrictions on certain streets. That meant I knew which streets could handle heavy traffic, which buildings had direct loading access, and which routes emergency vehicles used to navigate the city. Information that was becoming more valuable by the hour as normal traffic patterns broke down. The power grid started failing on day 5. I was patrolling near the state government complex when the first rolling blackouts hit. The traffic lights went dark, the street lights stopped working, and the electronic parking meters that I used to monitor every day became useless chunks of metal. But I knew from years of writing tickets near utility access points that the government buildings had backup generators and independent power systems. Information I filed away for later use. People were starting to abandon the city in large numbers. Interstate 17 north toward Flagstaff was packed with cars moving at walking speed, loaded down with whatever belongings people could fit. Interstate 10 west toward Los Angeles was even worse. I climbed up to the roof of the courthouse, a building I knew had roof access because I had chased parking violators up there before, and looked out over the highways. Miles of abandoned vehicles stretched in both directions, cars that had run out of gas or broken down in the suddenly brutal cold. That view from the courthouse roof showed me something else important. Most of the residential neighborhoods were going dark as people either fled or lost power, but certain buildings still had lights. The hospitals, some government facilities, and a few commercial buildings with their own power generation. I started making mental notes of which buildings were still operational, using the detailed knowledge of the city layout that I had built up over 8 years of walking the same streets every day. My radio became my lifeline to understanding what was happening beyond my immediate area. I switched between police frequencies, fire department channels, and emergency management communications, building a picture of how the city was falling apart. The police were overwhelmed with looting, domestic violence calls, and traffic accidents on the icy roads. The fire department was dealing with heating fires as people tried to stay warm using dangerous improvised methods. The hospitals were filling up with hypothermia cases and injuries from people who were not prepared for ice and snow in the desert. On day 6, I met my first group of survivors who needed my help. I was checking on the Federal Building, which I knew had good security and emergency systems, when I found a family huddled in the parking garage. They were from Minnesota, in Phoenix, for a court case that had been canceled due to the emergency. Their rental car had died. The hotels were all closed or full, and they had nowhere to go. They had been sleeping in their car for 2 nights and were close to freezing to death. I knew that the Federal Building had an employee break room with vending machines, emergency supplies, and most importantly, heat. My years of writing tickets in that building had given me relationships with the security guards and maintenance staff. I was able to get the family inside, at least temporarily, while they figured out how to get home to Minnesota. It was the first time I realized that my detailed knowledge of building, access, security procedures, and the people who worked in these places might be the difference between life and death. For other people, the family from Minnesota told me what they had seen on their drive through the city. Entire neighborhoods without power or heat, people burning furniture and books to stay warm, and stores being looted by increasingly desperate crowds. They had tried to buy supplies at several locations but found empty shelves and price gouging that made basic necessities unaffordable. They were educated, middle-class people who had money and resources, but none of that mattered when the normal systems broke down. Day 7 brought the first real snow I had ever seen in Phoenix. Not the ash mixed with ice crystals we had been getting, but actual snow falling from the sky and sticking to the ground. The temperature was 24 degrees, and the snow was accumulating faster than the ash had been. I stood outside the courthouse and watched Phoenix disappear under a blanket of white that should have been impossible in the Sonoran Desert. The snow made everything more dangerous and more urgent. Cars could not drive on the icy roads. Power lines were coming down under the weight of ice and snow, and people were getting trapped in buildings without heat or power. But the snow also revealed something important about the city's layout that I had never noticed before. The buildings that were still warm created patterns of melted snow around them, showing me which locations had reliable heat sources and which ones were losing the battle against the cold. I started encountering other city employees who were still trying to do their jobs despite the apocalyptic conditions. Police officers who knew me from years of coordinating traffic stops and parking enforcement. Firefighters who remembered me from incidents where illegally parked cars had blocked their access to emergencies. Maintenance workers from the buildings on my beat who had watched me write tickets every day for years. These relationships, built up through routine interactions over 8 years, suddenly became a network of people who trusted my judgment and knew I understood how the city worked. One of the police officers, Sergeant Martinez, told me something that changed my perspective on the crisis. The city government was evacuating to a secure facility outside Phoenix, and most emergency services were being consolidated at a few key locations. They were essentially abandoning large parts of the city to focus their limited resources on areas they thought they could protect. That meant the downtown area where I had worked for 8 years was going to be left without official help. Martinez asked me if I would be willing to help coordinate civilian assistance in the downtown area. My knowledge of the buildings, the infrastructure, and the people made me one of the few remaining city employees who could navigate the area effectively. He also mentioned that my radio training and communication skills would be valuable for maintaining contact with the consolidated emergency services. I agreed, not fully understanding what I was committing to, but knowing that my skills were needed. Day 8 was when I realized that this was not a temporary emergency that would be resolved in a few weeks. The radio reports from around the world painted a picture of global catastrophe. The volcanic ash was circling the entire planet, blocking sunlight and causing temperature drops on every continent. Crops were failing, transportation systems were shutting down, and governments were declaring martial law to maintain order. The scientists were no longer talking about weeks or months. They were using words like years and permanent climate change. I spent that day conducting my first real survey of the downtown area as a survival zone, rather than a traffic enforcement beat. I cataloged which buildings still had power, heat, and water. I identified potential sources of food, medical supplies, and other necessities. I mapped out safe routes between locations, avoiding areas where the roads were impassable, or where I had seen signs of violence and looting. My citation book became a survival manual as I documented everything that might be useful for keeping people alive. The government buildings were the most promising locations. They had backup power, emergency supplies, and communication equipment. The courthouse where I had worked for years had a cafeteria, medical facilities for employees, and multiple backup systems. The federal building had even better resources, including an emergency shelter area that most people did not know existed. My years of writing tickets in these buildings had given me access and knowledge that was now incredibly valuable. Day 9 brought my first real test as an emergency coordinator. A group of about 20 people had gathered in the lobby of the courthouse, looking for shelter and information. They were a mix of local residents whose homes had lost power, travelers who were stranded in the city, and homeless people who had been sleeping outside until the cold made that impossible. They looked to me for answers because I was wearing a city uniform and seemed to know what I was doing. I had to make decisions about who could stay in the courthouse, how to distribute the limited food and water supplies, and how to maintain order among people who were scared and desperate. My years of dealing with angry parking violators had taught me how to stay calm under pressure, how to be fair but firm, and how to defuse tense situations before they escalated. Those skills were essential for managing a group of people who were facing life or death circumstances. The group included people with skills that complemented my knowledge of the city. There was a nurse who had been visiting Phoenix for a medical conference, a mechanic who knew how to fix the heating systems in large buildings, and a former military logistics officer who understood supply management. I realized that survival was not going to be a solo effort, but would require organizing people with different skills and knowledge into an effective team. Day 10 was the day I stopped thinking like a traffic enforcement officer and started thinking like a survival leader. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, colder than Phoenix had ever been in recorded history. The snow was now over, 6 inches deep, and the ash underneath had frozen into a hard layer that made walking treacherous. Most of the city's population had either fled or died, leaving behind a landscape that looked like an Arctic wasteland in the middle of the desert. I made the decision to fully commit to helping the group of survivors who had gathered around me. That meant abandoning any pretense of enforcing parking regulations or maintaining normal city operations. It meant using my knowledge and skills for pure survival rather than law enforcement. It also meant accepting responsibility for other people's lives in ways that my job had never required before. The radio communications that day confirmed what I had been suspecting. This was not a regional disaster or even a national emergency. The volcanic winter was global, affecting every continent and every country. The normal systems of government, commerce, and social organization were breaking down everywhere. The world we had known was ending, and whatever came next would be built by people like us who had managed to survive the initial collapse. I spent the evening of day 10 planning how to expand our small group into a larger community that could survive long-term in downtown Phoenix. I identified other buildings that could serve as shelters, mapped out routes for scavenging supplies, and began thinking about how to establish communication with other survivor groups in the city. My citation book was now full of survival information instead of parking violations, and my radio was tuned to emergency frequencies instead of routine police chatter. The family from Minnesota that I had helped earlier found me that evening, with news that changed everything. They had been in contact with relatives in other cities and had learned that organized survivor communities were forming in locations with good resources and strong leadership. Places like military bases, university campuses, and government facilities were becoming centers for rebuilding civilization in the new frozen world. They suggested that our group in downtown Phoenix could become one of those centers if we organized properly and reached out to other survivors in the area. That night, as I listened to the wind howling through the frozen streets of Phoenix, I realized that my 8 years as a traffic enforcement officer had prepared me for this moment in ways I could never have imagined. I knew the city better than almost anyone. I had skills in communication, organization, and dealing with people under stress. I had relationships with other city employees and knowledge of emergency procedures. Most importantly, I had learned to pay attention to details, document everything, and think systematically about complex problems. The world was ending, but it was also beginning. Phoenix was becoming something new, and the people who survived the initial collapse would be the ones who built whatever came next. I had gone from writing parking tickets to coordinating survival efforts in 10 days, and I knew that the next phase would require even bigger changes and more difficult decisions. But I also knew that I had the knowledge and skills needed to help my group survive and maybe even thrive in the frozen world that Phoenix had become. Day 11 was when I stopped being a law enforcement officer and became a survival leader. The transformation happened when I woke up in the courthouse break room, surrounded by 23 people who were looking at me to make decisions that would keep them alive. The temperature outside was 8 degrees and the snow had accumulated to nearly a foot deep. Phoenix looked like Antarctica, and everyone who remained was counting on my knowledge of this frozen wasteland to survive. I had broken my first law the night before by using my master key to access areas of the courthouse that were supposed to be restricted to authorized personnel only. 8 years of writing parking tickets had given me relationships with building maintenance staff who trusted me with access codes and key locations. Now I was using that access to shelter people in government facilities without official permission. The irony was not lost on me that the guy who used to enforce the rules was now breaking them to save lives. The group that had formed around me was diverse in ways that made survival planning complicated, but also provided resources I never could have managed alone. Besides the nurse from the medical conference and the mechanic who understood heating systems, we now had a retired teacher who was good with children, a restaurant manager who understood food storage and preparation, and several college students who were strong enough for physical labor but inexperienced with crisis management. My job was to coordinate their skills while using my knowledge of Phoenix to find the resources we needed. Breaking into private property became a daily necessity, and each decision tested my transformation from rule enforcer to rule breaker. I knew which businesses on my old beat had emergency supplies, backup generators, and secure storage areas. The pharmacy on Central Avenue had medical supplies that our nurse needed for treating hypothermia and injuries. The restaurant supply warehouse near the courthouse had canned food that could feed our group for weeks. The sporting goods store had cold weather gear that none of us owned because Phoenix never got cold. My citation book had become a detailed inventory of every resource location, access point, and potential danger in downtown Phoenix. I documented which buildings still had working heat, which ones had frozen pipes that made them unusable, and which ones showed signs of other survivor groups that might be hostile. The methodical approach that had made me good at traffic enforcement was now essential for survival planning. Every detail could mean the difference between life and death. The moral conflicts were harder than the physical challenges. 8 years of enforcing parking regulations had built my identity around following rules and maintaining order. Now I was making decisions about taking food from abandoned stores, using other people's property for shelter, and distributing resources based on need rather than ownership. The nurse, whose name was Patricia, helped me understand that emergency conditions created different moral obligations. Saving lives justified actions that would be wrong under normal circumstances. Day 12 brought our first real test as an organized group. A blizzard moved through Phoenix, bringing wind and snow that made travel impossible and threatened to collapse the roofs of buildings not designed for snow loads. I had to make decisions about which locations were safe and which ones needed to be evacuated. My knowledge of building construction, gained from 8 years of noticing which structures had loading dock access and which ones had structural problems, became crucial for keeping people alive. The courthouse proved to be one of the most secure locations in downtown Phoenix. It had been built to withstand earthquakes and had backup power systems that were still functional. More importantly, it had multiple levels, so we could move people to lower floors if the roof became dangerous, and it had a cafeteria with commercial kitchen equipment that allowed us to prepare food for large groups. My familiarity with every hallway, stairwell, and storage room made me the logical person to coordinate our use of the building. Patricia, the nurse, taught me how to recognize and treat the medical problems that were becoming common in our frozen world. Hypothermia, frostbite, dehydration, and malnutrition were affecting everyone to some degree. She also explained how the stress of survival was causing mental health problems that required careful management. People who had never faced real hardship were breaking down under the pressure, while others were becoming aggressive and potentially dangerous. My experience dealing with angry parking violators helped me recognize warning signs and diffuse conflicts before they escalated. The radio communications on day 13 revealed information that changed our long-term planning. Other survivor groups in Phoenix were organizing around different locations. The airport had become a center for people trying to leave the city, but fuel shortages and weather conditions had stranded thousands of people there. The university campus was sheltering students and faculty in dormitories and academic buildings. Several shopping malls had become temporary communities using their large spaces and commercial infrastructure to support survivor populations. More concerning were reports of hostile groups that were raiding other communities for supplies and territory. The breakdown of law enforcement had created a power vacuum that was being filled by people willing to use violence to take what they needed. Some of these groups were organized around former gang members who had skills in illegal activities. Others were desperate families who had decided that their survival justified attacking other survivors. I realized that our peaceful community in the courthouse might not remain safe if we could not defend ourselves. Day 14 was when I had to make the hardest decision of the crisis so far. A group of 12 people approached the courthouse asking for shelter and food. They claimed to be refugees from a shopping mall community that had been attacked by raiders, but something about their story did not match what I had heard on the radio, and their behavior triggered the instincts I had developed from 8 years of dealing with people who lied about parking violations. I suspected they might be scouts for a hostile group, planning to infiltrate our community before attacking us. I had to choose between my natural inclination to help people in need and my responsibility to protect the people who were already counting on me for survival. After consulting with Patricia and the other leaders in our group, I made the decision to turn them away. It was the first time I had refused help to people who might have been legitimate refugees, and it felt like crossing a line that defined who I was as a person. But leadership in a survival situation required making decisions based on incomplete information and accepting responsibility for the consequences. The decision proved to be correct when we intercepted radio communications later that day, indicating that hostile groups were using fake refugees to gather intelligence about community, defenses, and resources. The group I had turned away was spotted near other survivor locations, apparently conducting reconnaissance rather than seeking genuine help. My instincts, developed from years of spotting people who were lying about expired parking meters, had potentially saved our community from infiltration and attack. Day 15 brought the first contact with other legitimate survivor communities that wanted to establish trade and mutual aid relationships. The university group had medical supplies and academic expertise, but needed food and security assistance. The airport group had access to aircraft parts and electronic equipment, but lacked heating fuel and warm clothing. Our courthouse community had secure shelter and my knowledge of resource locations throughout the city, but we needed medical expertise and technical skills that other groups possessed. I found myself serving as a diplomatic liaison between communities, using radio communications to negotiate resource exchanges and coordinate mutual defense agreements. My experience mediating disputes between angry drivers and managing crowd control during busy periods prepared me for the delicate negotiations required to build trust between groups that were all struggling to survive. The skills that had seemed mundane when I was writing parking tickets were now essential for building the foundations of a new society. The logistics of inter-community trade required mapping safe routes through the frozen city and establishing communication protocols that would allow coordination without revealing sensitive information about resources and defenses. I created detailed maps showing which roads were passable, which areas were controlled by hostile groups, and which buildings could serve as neutral meeting points for trade negotiations. My 8 years of learning every street and shortcut in Phoenix became the foundation for a transportation network that connected isolated survivor communities. Day 16 was when I realized that the skills I was developing as a survival leader were permanently changing who I was as a person. I was making life and death decisions every day, managing resources that determined whether people lived or died, and building relationships that would define how human society rebuilt itself in this frozen world. The careful attention to detail that had made me good at traffic enforcement was now being applied to much more important problems. Patricia pointed out that I was developing leadership qualities that went beyond just knowing the city layout. People trusted my judgment because I had demonstrated fairness and competence under pressure. I made decisions based on careful analysis rather than emotion, and I took responsibility for the consequences of those decisions. The group dynamics that I had learned from managing angry parking violators were now being used to maintain morale and resolve conflicts in a community facing existential threats. The radio traffic on Day 17 included disturbing reports about the global situation that put our local survival efforts into a broader context. The volcanic winter was not showing signs of ending, and scientists were revising their estimates about how long the temperature drops would continue. Instead of months, they were now talking about years of reduced sunlight and agricultural collapse. The implications were staggering. This was not a temporary emergency that would be followed by a return to normal conditions. This was permanent climate change that would require completely rebuilding human civilization. Food production had essentially stopped across most of the world. The existing stores of canned and preserved food would last months, not years. That meant survivor communities would need to develop new methods of food production that could work in the frozen conditions. Greenhouse cultivation, hydroponics, and other intensive farming methods would be essential, but they required technical knowledge and equipment that most communities lacked. The long-term survival of humanity would depend on preserving and sharing technical knowledge while adapting it to the new environmental conditions. Day 18 brought the first serious challenge to my leadership within our community. Some members of the group wanted to attempt the dangerous journey south to Mexico, believing that conditions would be better closer to the equator. Others wanted to try to reach family members in other cities, despite radio reports indicating that most transportation routes were impassable. A few people criticized my decisions about resource allocation, arguing that I was being too cautious about exploring new supply sources. I had to balance respect for individual autonomy with the need to maintain group cohesion and security. People who wanted to leave were free to go, but they could not take community resources with them, and they could not return if their plans failed. It was a harsh policy, but our survival depended on careful resource management and maintaining operational security. Every person who left took knowledge about our defenses and supplies that could be used against us if they were captured by hostile groups. The conflicts within the community forced me to articulate the principles that would guide our long-term development. We would make decisions democratically when possible, but emergency situations would require quick action by designated leaders. We would share resources based on need and contribution, but everyone would be expected to work according to their abilities. We would defend ourselves against threats, but we would not initiate violence against other communities. These principles became the foundation for what was essentially a new form of government adapted to survival conditions. Day 19 was when I began planning for the expansion of our community beyond the courthouse building. The success of our survival efforts was attracting other refugees who wanted to join us, but the courthouse had limited space and resources. I identified several other buildings in the downtown area that could be connected to our main facility through underground tunnels and covered walkways. My knowledge of the city's infrastructure, including utility tunnels that I had learned about while chasing parking violators into restricted areas, made it possible to create a larger community that could support more people while maintaining security. The expansion planning required balancing growth opportunities with security risks. Each new building would provide more space and resources, but it would also create more areas that needed to be defended and more access points that could be exploited by hostile groups. I had to think like both a urban planner and a military strategist, designing a community layout that would be efficient for daily operations but also defensible against attack. Patricia and I spent hours discussing the medical implications of community expansion. A larger population would provide more diverse skills and greater resilience against losses, but it would also increase the risk of disease outbreaks and resource shortages. We needed to establish medical protocols for screening new members, maintaining sanitation in crowded conditions, and treating injuries and illnesses with limited medical supplies. Her nursing expertise combined with my organizational skills created a framework for managing the health challenges of a growing survivor community. The radio communications on day 20 included the first reports of successful long-term survivor communities that were beginning to thrive rather than just survive. A group at a military base in Colorado had established reliable food production using greenhouse cultivation. A university community in Minnesota had developed renewable energy systems that provided heat and power through the winter. These success stories provided models for what our community could become if we made the right decisions and avoided the mistakes that had destroyed other groups. Day 20 brought validation that the choices I had made about leadership and community organization were working. Our courthouse community had grown to 47 people, and we had established trade relationships with 3 other survivor groups in Phoenix. We had reliable food supplies for several months, secure shelter that could protect us through the worst weather, and communication systems that kept us informed about threats and opportunities throughout the city. More importantly, we had maintained group cohesion and morale despite the incredible stress of survival in an apocalyptic environment. The transformation from traffic enforcement officer to survival leader was complete, but I realized that it was just the beginning of a much longer process of adaptation and growth. The frozen world we now lived in would require new forms of social organization, new methods of resource production and distribution, and new ways of making decisions about complex problems with life and death consequences. The skills I had developed during my first 20 days of leadership would need to be refined and expanded as our community grew and faced new challenges. Looking back on those first 3 weeks, I could see how each day had built on the previous one, creating a foundation of knowledge, relationships, and capabilities that made survival possible. But I could also see that the easy decisions were behind us. The next phase would require choices about expansion, defense, and long-term sustainability that would determine whether our community became a thriving center of civilization or another failed experiment in post-apocalyptic survival. Day 21 changed everything when we intercepted radio communications about a hostile group moving through downtown Phoenix, systematically raiding survivor communities and taking their resources by force. They called themselves the Reapers, and their leader was a former gang member who had organized other criminals and desperate people into a mobile raiding force. They had already hit the shopping mall community where over 60 people had been killed or driven into the frozen streets to die. The university group had gone silent after reporting armed attackers approaching their campus. Now the radio chatter indicated they were moving toward the government district where our courthouse community was located. I had 47 people, depending on my knowledge and leadership to keep them alive, and for the first time since the volcanic winter began, I was facing a threat that could not be solved through careful planning and resource management. The Reapers had weapons, vehicles that could still operate in the snow, and experience with violence that none of us possessed. My 8 years of writing parking tickets had not prepared me for military strategy or armed conflict, but I had to figure out how to protect our community against people who were willing to kill for supplies. Patricia and I spent the night developing contingency plans for different attack scenarios. The courthouse had multiple exits, including service tunnels, that connected to other buildings in the government complex. My detailed knowledge of these underground routes, gained from years of chasing parking violators who tried to escape through restricted areas, now became our primary escape plan if the building was overrun. We identified rally points where the community could regroup, supply caches that could sustain us if we had to abandon our main shelter, and communication protocols that would allow scattered groups to find each other. The mechanical systems expert in our group, a man named Rodriguez who had been maintaining office buildings before the crisis, helped me understand how to use the courthouse infrastructure as a defensive advantage. We could control access to different floors by disabling elevators and blocking stairwells. The heating system could be used to create smoke screens or deny heat to areas occupied by attackers. The emergency lighting systems could be manipulated to create darkness that would favor defenders who knew the building layout over attackers who did not. Day 22 brought the first direct evidence that the Reapers were operating in our area. We found the bodies of 3 people near the federal building, killed execution style and stripped of all their supplies. Radio communications from survivor groups east of downtown had gone silent, suggesting that the raiding force was moving systematically through the area, eliminating resistance and consolidating control over resources. I realized that our peaceful approach to community building had left us unprepared for the brutal realities of post-apocalyptic survival. The moral calculations that had seemed clear during our first 3 weeks of survival suddenly became much more complicated. Was it ethical to use deadly force to protect our community from people who were trying to kill us? Should we abandon our secure location and flee rather than risk a confrontation that could result in casualties? How could we maintain the cooperative principles that had made our community successful while also preparing for violent conflict with people who rejected those principles entirely? I made the decision to send scouts to gather intelligence about the raider force while preparing the courthouse for siege conditions. My knowledge of the city's layout allowed me to identify observation points where our people could monitor approaches to the government district without being detected. The old traffic enforcement techniques of positioning myself to observe violations while remaining inconspicuous proved useful for surveillance operations. We needed to know how many people we were facing, what weapons they had, and how they operated during attacks. The intelligence we gathered over the next 2 days was both reassuring and terrifying. The raider force numbered about 30 people, fewer than I had feared, but they were well armed with hunting rifles, handguns, and military equipment taken from abandoned National Guard facilities. They traveled in modified pickup trucks and SUVs equipped with snow tires and extra fuel tanks. Most importantly, they had developed tactics for attacking fortified positions, using coordinated assaults and siege techniques that suggested some of them had military training. Day 24 was when I had to make the hardest decision of my life. The Reapers had established a forward base in the shopping center 2 miles from the courthouse, and radio intercepts indicated they were planning to attack our community within 48 hours. I could either order an evacuation that would abandon everything we had built and leave us scattered and vulnerable in the frozen city, or I could commit our community to a defensive battle against people who had more experience with violence than we did. I chose to fight, but not in the way the Reapers expected. Instead of waiting for them to attack our fortified position, I decided to use my knowledge of the city to set up an ambush that would neutralize their mobility advantage and force them to fight on terrain that favored our defensive preparations. My 8 years of understanding traffic patterns, choke points, and sightlines throughout downtown Phoenix became the foundation for a military strategy that could potentially save our community. The plan required splitting our force and coordinating actions across multiple locations, using radio communications and precise timing to execute successfully. I positioned teams at key intersections that the raider vehicles would have to pass through to reach the courthouse. Rodriguez and his mechanical team prepared roadblocks and obstacles that would funnel the attackers into predetermined kill zones. Patricia organized medical stations and evacuation routes for our own casualties. Everyone in the community had a specific role based on their skills and knowledge. The most difficult part of the planning was accepting that some of our people would probably die in the fighting. These were not professional soldiers or police officers, but ordinary civilians who had never fired weapons at other human beings. The retired teacher was going to operate a radio station. The college students were going to move equipment and supplies under fire. The restaurant manager was going to coordinate ammunition distribution. I was asking people to risk their lives, based on my judgment about military tactics that I was learning as I planned them. Day 25 was the day of the battle that would determine whether our community survived or became another casualty of the post-apocalyptic chaos. The Reapers approached the government district exactly as our intelligence had predicted, using 3 vehicles in a coordinated attack formation, designed to overwhelm defensive positions through superior mobility and firepower. But my knowledge of downtown Phoenix traffic patterns allowed me to predict their route and establish ambush positions that turned their mobility into a disadvantage. The first phase of the battle went according to our plan. The roadblocks and obstacles forced the raider vehicles into the narrow streets where we had positioned our defensive teams. The lead vehicle hit a barrier that Rodriguez had constructed using traffic control equipment and city maintenance supplies, disabling it and blocking the route for the vehicles behind it. Our people opened fire from concealed positions in buildings that I had identified based on my knowledge of sight lines and cover options throughout the area. But the Reapers were more experienced and better organized than I had anticipated. Instead of panicking when their initial assault was stopped, they deployed on foot and began a systematic attack on our positions using fire and movement tactics that suggested military training. They had radios and were coordinating their assault much more effectively than our improvised defensive plan could counter. Within minutes, it became clear that our ambush was turning into a prolonged firefight that would favor the side with more experience and better weapons. I had to make real-time decisions about repositioning our people, redistributing ammunition, and maintaining communication between scattered defensive positions while under fire from people who were trying to kill me. The stress of combat leadership was unlike anything I had experienced during 8 years of traffic enforcement, but the basic skills of situational awareness, clear communication, and quick decision-making proved to be transferable. I could assess the tactical situation, identify problems that needed immediate attention, and coordinate responses using the radio networks we had established. The turning point came when Patricia, operating from her medical station in the courthouse basement, intercepted Raider radio communications indicating that their leader had been wounded and that some of their people wanted to withdraw rather than continue the attack. She relayed this information to me, and I realized that the Reapers were not as committed to the fight as they had appeared. They were raiders, not soldiers, and they were accustomed to easy victories against unprepared victims rather than determined resistance from organized defenders. I ordered our teams to increase the pressure on the raider positions while broadcasting surrender ultimatums on the radio frequencies they were using. The combination of continued resistance and offers of medical treatment for their wounded created divisions within the raider force that ultimately led to their withdrawal. 3 of their people surrendered and provided information about other raider operations in the Phoenix area. The rest retreated to their vehicles and fled south toward Tucson, leaving behind weapons and supplies that significantly improved our defensive capabilities. The battle cost our community 4 dead and 7 wounded, including Rodriguez, who had been shot while defending one of the roadblock positions. Patricia worked for 18 hours straight, treating injuries with limited medical supplies, and her skill probably saved 2 people who would have died from blood loss and trauma. The college students who had been afraid to handle weapons at the beginning of the fight proved to be brave and effective under fire. The retired teacher coordinated radio communications so well that we maintained contact between all our positions throughout the battle. Day 26 was when I had to deal with the psychological aftermath of leading people through their first combat experience. Several community members were suffering from what Patricia identified as traumatic stress reactions. Others were angry about the casualties we had suffered and wanted to pursue the retreating raiders to ensure they could never threaten us again. A few people questioned whether the decision to fight had been worth the cost in lives and resources. I realized that leadership during a survival crisis involved much more than just making tactical decisions about defense and resource allocation. It required helping people process traumatic experiences, maintaining morale after losses, and preserving the community cohesion that made survival possible. The skills I had developed for managing angry parking violators were useful for diffusing tensions and maintaining authority, but the emotional challenges of combat leadership required new approaches that I was learning through trial and error. The intelligence we gained from the captured raiders revealed that our community was now seen as a significant threat by other hostile groups in the region. Our successful defense had demonstrated capabilities that made us a target for future attacks, but it had also established a reputation that might deter weaker groups from attempting raids. I had to balance the increased security risks against the improved defensive capabilities and higher morale that resulted from our victory. Day 27 brought radio contact with military units that were still operating in Arizona, attempting to maintain government authority and provide assistance to survivor communities. A National Guard unit based in Flagstaff was conducting relief operations and establishing communication networks between isolated communities. They offered to provide security assistance and supply drops in exchange for intelligence about raider activities and cooperation with their efforts to restore order in the region. The decision about whether to accept military assistance involved complex considerations about autonomy and control that I had not anticipated when I first started organizing our survival efforts. Military protection would significantly improve our security situation, but it would also mean accepting external authority over decisions that our community had been making democratically. I had to balance the immediate benefits of professional security against the long-term implications of giving up the independence that had allowed us to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Patricia and I spent hours discussing the philosophical implications of reintegrating with government authority. After 3.5 weeks of autonomous survival, our community had developed its own methods for making decisions, allocating resources, and resolving conflicts that were adapted to our specific circumstances and capabilities. Military oversight might improve our physical security, but could undermine the cooperative relationships and innovative problem-solving that had made our survival possible. Day 28 was when I made the decision to accept limited cooperation with the National Guard while maintaining our community's autonomy over internal affairs. We would share intelligence about raider activities and provide assistance with regional coordination efforts, but we would not accept military authority over our resource allocation, membership decisions, or internal governance. This compromise position allowed us to benefit from external security assistance while preserving the community structures that had proven successful during our first month of survival. The agreement with the National Guard included provisions for regular supply, drops, medical evacuation services for serious injuries, and communication links with other cooperating communities throughout Arizona. In exchange, we committed to providing detailed intelligence reports about hostile groups, maintaining emergency services capabilities that could assist other communities, and participating in regional planning efforts for long-term recovery operations. Day 29 brought the first supply drop from the National Guard, including medical supplies that Patricia desperately needed for treating ongoing health problems in our community, cold weather gear that improved our ability to operate outside during the worst weather, and communication equipment that expanded our ability to coordinate with other survivor groups. The supplies were accompanied by a military liaison officer who provided training in defensive tactics and intelligence, gathering techniques that improved our security capabilities. The liaison officer, a sergeant named Williams who had been coordinating survivor assistance operations throughout central Arizona, confirmed that our community was one of the most successful civilian survival groups in the region. Our combination of secure facilities, organized leadership, and cooperative relationships with other communities had created a model that was being studied for implementation elsewhere. The knowledge and skills that I had developed during my transformation from traffic enforcement officer to survival leader were apparently transferable to other situations and locations. Williams also provided sobering information about the global situation that put our local success into perspective. The volcanic winter was showing no signs of ending, and agricultural production had essentially stopped throughout the northern hemisphere. The existing food supplies would be exhausted within 6 to 8 months, creating a worldwide famine that would kill billions of people unless alternative food production methods could be developed and implemented quickly. Our short-term survival success was just the beginning of much longer and more difficult challenges. Day 30 was when I realized that the 30 days since the volcanic eruptions began had transformed me from a traffic enforcement officer into the leader of a community that was becoming a permanent settlement rather than a temporary survival group. Our courthouse community now had 63 members, secure facilities that could support continued growth, reliable supply relationships with both military and civilian sources, and defensive capabilities that could protect us against most threats in the post-apocalyptic environment. But day 30 was also when I understood that the real challenges were just beginning. The winter would continue for years, requiring us to develop sustainable food production, renewable energy systems, and manufacturing capabilities that could maintain our civilization without support from the collapsed global economy. The community organization and leadership skills that had enabled our survival during the first month would need to be expanded and institutionalized to manage the complex challenges of rebuilding human society in a permanently altered world. The citation book that I had been using to document our survival efforts was now completely filled with information about resource locations, community member skills, defensive preparations, and relationship agreements with other groups. It had become the historical record of our community's foundation and the reference manual for our ongoing operations. Patricia suggested that I should continue documenting our development as we transitioned from survival mode to permanent settlement, creating a record that could help other communities learn from our experiences and avoid our mistakes. As I prepared for sleep on day 30, I reflected on the transformation that had brought me from writing parking tickets on familiar city streets to leading a community of survivors in a frozen wasteland. The knowledge and skills that had seemed mundane during my 8 years of traffic enforcement had proven to be exactly what was needed for survival leadership in an apocalyptic crisis. The attention to detail, the understanding of urban systems, the experience with crisis management, and the ability to maintain authority while treating people fairly had all been essential for our success. The next phase of our community's development would require new challenges and different skills, but the foundation we had built during those first 30 days would support whatever came next. Phoenix was no longer the city I had known for 34 years, but it was becoming something new and potentially better. The frozen world that had seemed like the end of everything was actually the beginning of a new chapter in human civilization, and our community was going to help write that chapter. Day 31 marked the beginning of what I now understand was the second phase of our survival story. The immediate crisis of finding shelter, food, and security had been replaced by the much more complex challenge of building a sustainable community that could thrive for years in the frozen world that Phoenix had become. Our courthouse settlement now housed 71 people, and the decisions I made as their leader would determine whether we became a thriving center of the new civilization or just another failed experiment in post-apocalyptic survival. The Ellery National Guard liaison, Sergeant Williams, brought disturbing intelligence about conditions throughout the Southwest. The volcanic winter was intensifying rather than stabilizing, with temperatures continuing to drop and snowfall increasing week by week. Agricultural regions that had initially hoped to salvage partial harvests were now reporting total crop failures. The food distribution systems that had kept cities supplied were completely broken, and urban populations were either fleeing to rural areas or dying of starvation and exposure. More troubling were the reports about social breakdown accelerating throughout the region. Military units were being withdrawn from civilian support operations to defend critical infrastructure and government facilities. Local law enforcement had essentially ceased to exist in most areas, leaving survivor communities to defend themselves against increasingly desperate and violent groups. The Reapers that we had defeated were just one of dozens of raider gangs that were forming throughout Arizona, preying on weaker communities and growing stronger with each successful attack. Patricia had been analyzing the medical data from our community and identified health trends that would affect our long-term survival planning. Malnutrition was becoming a serious problem despite our careful resource management, because the canned and preserved foods we were living on lacked essential nutrients that people needed for sustained health. Respiratory problems were increasing due to the ash particles that were still falling with the snow, requiring better air filtration systems in our living areas. Most concerning were the psychological stress indicators that suggested some community members were developing serious mental health problems that could threaten group cohesion. The technical challenges of sustainable survival were becoming more apparent as our initial supplies were consumed and equipment began to fail. Rodriguez, our mechanical systems expert, who had been wounded defending the roadblocks, was recovering, but had identified critical infrastructure problems that needed immediate attention. The heating systems in the courthouse were not designed for continuous operation at maximum capacity, and components were beginning to fail. The backup generators required fuel and maintenance supplies that were becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. The water systems were vulnerable to freezing despite our insulation efforts. Day 32 brought the first serious internal conflict within our community since the raider attack. A group of 15 people, led by one of the college students, who had performed well during the battle, argued that we should abandon the courthouse and attempt to reach California, where they believed conditions would be better and government services were still functioning. They wanted to take vehicles, weapons, and a share of our food supplies for the journey, which would significantly weaken our community's capabilities and security. I had to balance respect for individual freedom with the need to protect community resources and maintain group cohesion. The intelligence from Sergeant Williams indicated that the routes to California were extremely dangerous, with blocked highways, hostile territory controlled by raider groups, and government forces that were shooting refugees to prevent the spread of disease and civil unrest. But I could not simply forbid people from leaving, because that would undermine the democratic principles that had made our community attractive to new members. The debate about whether to allow the departure consumed 2 days and revealed fundamental disagreements about our community's future direction. Some people supported the right of individuals to leave and take resources with them, arguing that forced retention was essentially slavery. Others contended that everyone who had benefited from community protection and shared resources had obligations to the group that could not be dissolved simply by deciding to leave. The conflict tested my leadership abilities in ways that the External threats had not. I ultimately decided to allow people to leave but without taking community weapons or vehicles, which were essential for our collective defense. They could take personal belongings and a small amount of food, but not the supplies that had been acquired through group efforts and were needed for the survival of the people who remained. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but preserved the community's viability while respecting individual autonomy. 12 people left on day 34, including some individuals whose skills would be difficult to replace. But their departure also revealed the strength of community, bonds that had developed among the people who chose to stay. The remaining 59 members were more committed to collective survival and more willing to accept the difficult decisions that long-term sustainability would require. Patricia observed that the crisis had clarified our community's values and strengthened the social cohesion that would be essential for future challenges. Day 35 brought radio contact with survivor communities in other regions that were developing innovative solutions to the challenges we were facing. Group in Colorado had successfully established greenhouse food production using geothermal heating and artificial lighting powered by solar panels. A community in Minnesota had developed alcohol fuel production using organic waste, reducing their dependence on increasingly scarce gasoline and diesel. A settlement in Montana had created workshop facilities for manufacturing tools, clothing, and equipment that could not be scavenged from abandoned buildings. These success stories provided models for expanding our community's capabilities beyond basic survival toward genuine self-sufficiency. But they also revealed the scale of technical knowledge and specialized equipment that would be required for advanced survival technologies. We needed people with engineering skills, agricultural expertise, and manufacturing experience. We needed tools, materials, and power sources that were not available through scavenging operations. Most importantly, we needed to establish trade, relationships with other communities that could provide resources and knowledge that we could not develop independently. The strategic planning sessions that Patricia and I conducted during the 5th week of our community's existence were focused on identifying the technical capabilities we needed to acquire and the resources we needed to secure for long-term sustainability. My knowledge of Phoenix's industrial and commercial infrastructure became crucial for locating the specialized equipment and materials that were required for manufacturing, agriculture, and energy production. The detailed city maps that I had developed during 8 years of traffic enforcement were now being used to plan industrial scavenging operations. Day 37 was when we discovered that our community's success had made us a target for a much more dangerous threat than the raider gangs we had been preparing to defend against. Radio intercepts revealed that a military unit had gone rogue and was establishing control over survivor communities throughout central Arizona, using their superior weapons and organization to impose martial law and extract tribute from civilian settlements. They called themselves the Arizona Liberation Army, and their leader was a former National Guard colonel who claimed to be restoring order and government authority. The intelligence about the ALA was disturbing because it suggested a level of organization and capability that our community could not effectively resist. Unlike the Reapers, who were essentially criminals taking advantage of the crisis, the ALA had military training, heavy weapons, and a political agenda that justified their actions as necessary for regional stability. They were not raiding communities for immediate supplies but establishing permanent control over territory and populations, creating a feudal system with themselves as the ruling class. Sergeant Williams confirmed that the ALA was considered a hostile force by legitimate military authorities, but resources were not available to conduct operations against them. The National Guard units that were still functioning were focused on protecting critical government facilities and major population centers, leaving rural and suburban communities to deal with the ALA threat independently. Our community was essentially on its own against a force that had already subjugated dozens of other settlements. The moral and strategic implications of the ALA threat forced me to reconsider everything about our community's development and future plans. We could not simply defend our courthouse settlement against a military force that had armored vehicles, heavy weapons, and professional soldiers. We could not flee to another location because the ALA was expanding their control throughout the IS region. We could not negotiate from a position of strength because we lacked the military capabilities that would make us valuable allies rather than just another community to be conquered. Day 38 was when I made the decision that would define our community's character and determine our survival strategy for the indefinite future. Instead of waiting for the ALA to eventually reach our location and impose their control, I decided to proactively organize resistance against them in cooperation with other threatened communities. My experience coordinating defensive operations against the Reapers had demonstrated that civilian communities could successfully resist military threats if they used appropriate tactics and maintained effective cooperation. The resistance plan required establishing secure communication networks with other communities that were threatened by the ALA, coordinating intelligence-gathering operations that could track their movements and capabilities, and developing asymmetric warfare tactics that could neutralize their advantages in conventional military confrontations. My knowledge of Phoenix's infrastructure and terrain would be crucial for planning operations that used urban warfare techniques to offset the ALA's superior equipment and training. Patricia initially opposed the resistance plan because it would expose our community to much greater risks and could result in massive casualties if we were unsuccessful, but she eventually agreed that submission to ALA control would essentially end our community's autonomy and condemn us to serfdom under a military dictatorship. The choice was between accepting permanent subjugation or fighting for the freedom to determine our own future, even if that fight involved significant risks. The preparation for resistance operations revealed capabilities within our community that had not been apparent during our defensive preparations against the Reapers. Several of our members had military or law enforcement backgrounds that provided expertise in tactics, weapons, and communications. The college students who had wanted to leave for California turned out to have technical skills that were valuable for intelligence gathering and sabotage operations. Even the retired teacher proved to have organizational abilities that were essential for coordinating complex operations involving multiple communities. Day 40 brought the first coordinated resistance operation against an ALA patrol that was conducting reconnaissance in our area. Using intelligence from multiple communities and radio intercepts, we were able to ambush a 3-vehicle convoy on Interstate 17 north of Phoenix, capturing weapons and equipment while demonstrating that the ALA was not invulnerable to well-planned attacks by determined civilian forces. The success of the operation encouraged other communities to join the resistance network and provided valuable intelligence about ALA capabilities and procedures. But the ambush also escalated the conflict and made our community a priority target for ALA retaliation. Radio intercepts indicated that they were planning a major operation to destroy the resistance network and establish permanent control over the Phoenix metropolitan area. The timeline for their offensive was unclear, but intelligence suggested it would happen within days rather than weeks. We had succeeded in demonstrating that resistance was possible, but we had also committed ourselves to a conflict that could result in the destruction of everything we had built. The preparation for the expected ALA offensive required transforming our courthouse community from a civilian settlement into a military base while maintaining the cooperative relationships and democratic decision-making that had made our survival possible. I had to balance the operational security requirements of military planning with the transparency and participation that our community members expected. The leadership skills that had developed during 5 weeks of survival challenges were being tested by the much more complex requirements of organizing armed resistance against professional military forces. Day 42 was when radio intelligence confirmed that the ALA was massing forces for a coordinated assault on resistance communities throughout the Phoenix area. Their plan involved simultaneous attacks on 5 different settlements designed to prevent mutual support and eliminate the resistance network through overwhelming force. Our courthouse community was identified as the primary target because of our central location and our role in coordinating resistance activities throughout the region. The intelligence also revealed that the ALA had grown significantly since their initial operations began, incorporating deserters from legitimate military units and recruiting civilians who were attracted to their promise of security and order. They now had over 200 personnel, including experienced soldiers with specialized training in urban warfare and siege operations. Their equipment included armored vehicles, heavy weapons, and communication systems that gave them significant advantages over civilian resistance forces. Patricia and I spent the night before the expected attack reviewing our contingency plans and discussing the possibility that our community might not survive the coming battle. We had prepared multiple evacuation routes, established supply caches throughout the city, and created communication protocols that would allow scattered survivors to regroup and continue resistance operations even if the courthouse was captured or destroyed. But we both understood that the scale of the threat was beyond anything we had faced during our first 6 weeks of survival. Day 43 was the day that would determine whether our community's transformation from traffic enforcement officer and medical conference attendee to resistance leaders had prepared us for the ultimate test of our survival capabilities. The ALA assault began at dawn with artillery bombardment of our defensive positions, followed by armored vehicle attacks on multiple approaches to the courthouse complex. The professional military tactics that they employed were designed to overwhelm civilian defenders through superior firepower and coordinated movement. But our defensive preparations took advantage of knowledge and capabilities that the ALA had not anticipated. My understanding of Phoenix's infrastructure allowed us to use utility tunnels, drainage systems, and building connections to move personnel and supplies without being detected by their surveillance. Rodriguez's expertise with building systems enabled us to control lighting, heating, and security systems throughout the government complex, creating confusion and misdirection that disrupted their assault plans. Patricia's medical training allowed us to treat casualties and maintain combat effectiveness, despite significant losses. The battle for the courthouse lasted 14 hours and involved urban warfare tactics that neither side had expected when the conflict began. The ALA's superior equipment and training were offset by our knowledge of the terrain and our motivation to defend our homes and community. Their attempts to establish control over key buildings were frustrated by our ability to move through hidden routes and attack their positions from unexpected directions. Their heavy weapons were less effective in the confined spaces and complex structures of the government district. The turning point came when other resistance communities launched coordinated attacks on ALA supply lines and command facilities, forcing them to divert resources from the courthouse assault to defend their own positions. The radio communications that had initially coordinated our defensive efforts were now being used to coordinate offensive operations throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. The resistance network that had seemed vulnerable to ALA military superiority was proving to be more resilient and capable than anyone had anticipated. Day 44 brought the withdrawal of ALA forces from the government district and radio. Reports that their offensive operations throughout the region had been unsuccessful. The resistance network had not only survived their coordinated assault, but had inflicted significant casualties and captured substantial equipment and supplies. More importantly, the successful defense had demonstrated that civilian communities could maintain their autonomy against military threats if they were properly organized and adequately motivated. The cost of our victory was substantial. 18 people from our community had been killed during the battle, including Rodriguez, who had been operating building systems when an artillery shell struck his position. 26 others were wounded, stretching Patricia's medical capabilities to their limits. The courthouse building had been severely damaged, requiring extensive repairs before it could provide adequate shelter for our reduced population. But we had preserved our independence and maintained our role as a center of resistance against authoritarian control. The aftermath of the ALA offensive revealed that the conflict had fundamentally changed the balance of power throughout Central Arizona. The resistance network had evolved from a defensive alliance into an offensive coalition that was capable of conducting military operations against organized threats. Our community's role as a coordination center had made us one of the most important settlements in the region, with responsibilities and capabilities that extended far beyond our original survival goals. Day 45 was when I realized that my transformation from traffic enforcement officer to community leader to resistance coordinator had prepared me for a role that I had never imagined when the volcanic eruptions began 6.5 weeks earlier. The knowledge and skills that had seemed relevant only to writing parking tickets and managing minor disputes were now being applied to military strategy, regional politics, and the foundations of post-apocalyptic civilization. The mundane details of city government and law enforcement had become the building blocks of survival and freedom in the frozen world that Phoenix had become. Patricia and I discussed the implications of our success and the responsibilities that came with being leaders of a community that had become central to the emerging structure of human society in our region. The decisions we made about resource allocation, defensive preparations, and relationships with other communities would affect thousands of people and could determine whether the principles of democracy and cooperation survived the collapse of the old world. The stakes had grown far beyond our original goal of simply staying alive through the winter. As I prepared this recording on day 45, I understood that our story was no longer just about one community's survival, but about the larger question of what kind of society would emerge from the ruins of the old civilization. The courthouse community had become a symbol of the possibility that people could organize themselves democratically, defend their freedom against authoritarian threats, and build sustainable communities based on cooperation rather than domination. Our success or failure would influence how other communities approach the challenges of post-apocalyptic survival. The frozen world that had seemed like the end of everything 6 weeks ago was revealing itself to be the beginning of something new and potentially better than what had come before. The crisis that had destroyed the old civilization was also creating opportunities for building new forms of human society that could be more just, more sustainable, and more resilient than the systems they were replacing. Our community in the Phoenix courthouse was just one example of what was becoming possible in the transformed world.